wanted to spend some time today in chapter 11. I'm going to present it my way, which is not exactly the book's way, but maybe looking at it from two different explanations, it becomes clear. We're going to stay first off with a kind of a straight Keynesian model. So there's your sharp break aggregate supply curve. And the supply curve is vertical at full employment. And let's say that full employment occurs at $1,600 billion worth of output. We'll just give it a number. And then let's say that the aggregate demand curve is over here, showing you an equilibrium of 1,200, which I'll call Q star or sometimes Y star, same idea. So when you look at this graph, what do you conclude? What's going on in the economy? You're in a recession. This is how much people are spending and buying, but the economy is capable of producing even more. So there's a lot of slack in the economy, meaning that if this is an unemployment rate of 5%, we're probably looking at an unemployment rate of something higher than that. Arbitrarily, let's call it 8%. Okay, so far. How much more spending do we need in the economy to create enough jobs to put everybody back to work? Listen to how that question is phrased. How much more total spending, or how much of an increase in aggregate demand do we need to move to full employment? The answer is $400, right? Now the $400, my terminology here, actually used by a lot of places, I think it's also used in the book. The terminology for that is that we have a spending gap. We have a gap between here where we are and full employment. In this case, it's a recessionary gap because it is causing a recession because we have too little spending. So we've got a recessionary gap of $400. Okay, so far? What chapter 11 will bring you through is how do you use the marginal propensity to consume and the multiplier to decide how much more government spending you need to push aggregate demand out to full employment. Or how much tax cuts do you need to increase aggregate demand to full employment. And now this is my stuff for sure. Here's how it goes. If we're going to use government spending as our fiscal policy tool, let's use that one first. Our equation looks like this. Delta, I'm going to use Y star now, Y star, same as Q star. Delta Y star equals K times delta G. That's the equation you want to keep in mind. Now, what do the terms mean? Delta Y star is the change in equilibrium that we want. It's at $400. Delta Y star is the gap. We know that's 400. How do you find K? What would you need to know?
The MPC.
The MPC. So if we were also told in this model, the consumption function is 164 plus 0.90 YD, what is the MPC? 0.90, the coefficient in front of Y. So if we know the MPC is 0.9 or 0.90, how do we calculate the multiplier? 1 over 1 minus the MPC, which is 1 over 1 minus 0.90, which is 1 over 0.10, which is 10. Everybody with me on that? So we know the multiplier is 10. Now we just have to solve how much is delta G, the change in government spending we need to stimulate the economy out to full employment. That's pretty easy, right? Dividing both sides by 10, delta G equals 40. We want to increase spending or decrease spending? Increase it, because we're in a recession, we don't have enough spending. So there's your first solution in terms of what fiscal policy do we need to implement, or how much more spending do we need by government to move the economy to full employment. And remember, if government spends $40, that money gets multiplied down at Cafe Risque, right? And expands total spending. The same thing would work if we had up here an inflationary gap. This demand curve out here would show us that we're spending this much money, which is way more than the economy produced. So maybe out here, total spending would be, 2,000. Well, the numbers work the same way. But instead of a recessionary gap, what kind of gap have we got? We have an inflationary gap of 400, but the numbers work the same way. 400 equals K times delta G. It's just that when we got 40 here, again, what would be the difference? We need a decrease in spending to treat inflation. That's all. We doing okay with that? Everybody tracking with me? Not rocket science. Well, let's look at the other possibility. What if we wanted to, see if I can find a good marker here. Instead of using government spending, let's use taxes as our fiscal policy tool to go from this recession into full employment. We know conceptually, what do we need to do with taxes? Increase them or decrease them? Decrease them, because we need more spending. Well, here's the equation, and it's only slightly different. Delta Y star equals K times the MPC times the change in taxes. That's our equation for using taxes. So if we plug the numbers in there, they're very similar, but they're not quite the same. The gap is still 400. The multiplier is still 10. But the MPC is 0.90. And now solve for delta TX, the change in taxes that we need. When you do that, you get 40 divided by 9 is the change in taxes. You okay with that? Everybody following me on that? So what's 40 divided by 9? You might have a calculator convenient to hand. 4.4444 repeating. Good. 4 or 40? 44, I'm sorry. 9 into 400. 44.44. Okay so far? You need to increase taxes or decrease taxes?
Decrease.
Increase because we're in a recession. We need more spending. I'm sorry, decrease. I said that backwards. We need to decrease taxes because we need more spending. So here's option 2 on our fiscal policies. Here was option 1 on our fiscal policies. And now you get a sense of how you calculate the numbers, because chapter 11 will have you calculating the numbers. And if you follow the way the book explains it and everything, that's super. You'll be fine. But if this puts a little bit different view on it, maybe a little simpler view on it, then use this. You'll still get the right answer. You just got to interpret the answer, the questions, you know. We'll do a couple of examples here in a minute. Comments from anybody? Questions so far? Can I erase the board? Okay? So for example, if they come along and say, we have an economy with an MPC of 0.85, and we have a $2,000 inflationary gap. How much do we need to change government spending to move the economy to full employment without inflation? And that's all they tell you. How would you solve that?
With the taxes?
This wants to know how much would you change government spending. So you should recall the equation first. Delta Y star equals K delta G, and then plug in the numbers that you know. Delta Y star is always the gap. So we have 2,000 here. What's K in this model? 1 over 1 minus the MPC. 1 over 1 minus 0.85, 1 divided by 0.15. What's 0.15 into 100 into 1? 6.67 times delta G. Everybody with me on that part so far? Remember how to get the multiplier. So then we're just going to divide 2,000 divided by 6.67. That's delta G. How much is that?
$299.85.
$299.85?
Yes.
Yeah. Close enough. We're rounding just a little bit, but that's our solution. Do we need to increase or decrease spending?
Decrease.
Decrease it?
You're in an inflationary gap.
Yes, very right, very correct. We have inflation, too much spending, so we need to decrease government spending by $299 and change to get to full employment without inflation, to remove the inflation from the model. How we doing? Okay, let's do one more just for grins. Okay. This time they tell us we have a $600 recessionary gap. The marginal propensity to save is 0.20. How much do we need to change taxes to get to full employment without inflation? So I'm making you these taxes, and I gave you the marginal propensity to save, not the marginal propensity to consume. So first, when you see taxes, you want to remember this equation because you won't have it available to you. It's got to be memorized. And then you got to figure out how to plug the numbers in for that. How did we get 600? Delta Y is always the gap. How did we get 5? We know that if the MPS is 0.20, the MPS plus the MPC equals 100% of your income, 1.00. If the MPS is 0.20 and it's got to equal 1, then this has got to be 0.80 for the MPC. How do we get K? Think about this. K is 1 over 1 minus the MPC. But we could write that a different way, couldn't we? K is what?
1 divided MPS.
Perfect. 1 divided by the MPS. It's the same thing. 1 minus the MPC, 1 minus the MPC is the MPS, 0.20. So K is 1 divided by 0.20, it's 5. That's where the 5 came from. And we know the MPC because we figured it out. We plugged that in. 80% of 5 is 4. 600 divided by 4 is 150. How are we doing so far? Any questions? Any hesitation?
You need to decrease taxes by?
That's my next question. You want to decrease taxes or increase taxes?
Well, you're in a recession.
You're in a recession.
So you want to decrease
You want to decrease taxes so people have more money to spend, so we want a $150 tax cut for the economy. We're doing okay with that? Did you guys do this in AP?
Yeah.
Okay. Did you do it the same way, or was it?
I think so. For the taxes, I remember this way. I don't really remember the government spending much.
Okay, cool. This is pure Keynesian economics. It's a belief in fiscal policy. Other things they can do. Take a look at this. If the Keynesian curve looks this way, the sharp break curve, and we're down here, let's give it some numbers. We'll still keep that at 1,600. We'll keep that at 1,200. The Keynesian belief is if you make the right change, what happens? The aggregate demand curve goes out to the sharp break, AD prime. You go from equilibrium at point A to equilibrium at point B, and everybody lives happily ever after. But what else do we know in reality? We know that the Keynesian sharp break curve is just a simplistic way of explaining Keynes. It makes it real easy. In reality, what does that supply curve look like? Do you remember that? What does that supply curve look like in reality?
curve.
It's got some curve to it. At some point, yeah, it may be flat for a while, but at some point, it starts going like that. And yeah, it may have some vertical part to it. But look what happens in reality. If you increase your spending, the way we were talking in the last model, you change spending by $40 because the MPC is 0.90, and you think, hey, I'm going to go from A to B, but when in fact, where do you go? You go up here on the real supply curve to point C. And what's happened as a result of your fiscal policy? You got more employment and you got more output, but you didn't get it all the way to full employment. Instead, some of that extra spending was in the form of buying stuff at higher prices. The price level rose. So if we take the Keynesian view with a sharp break, we know that's a little oversimplified for reality. And we know that this $40 increase in spending is still not going to cure our unemployment problem, but in fact it's going to give us somewhat, we don't know how much, somewhat of an inflationary problem too. Because reality is lived in here. Not up here, the way the classical view said, not down here, the way Keynes said. Reality is we're in here where there is a constant trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And at different points in the textbook, they try to make that point to you. Okay? What's better, high inflation or high unemployment?
Yes.
Yes. Depends on what? For you or I personally, what would it depend on our answer? What's better, high inflation or high unemployment?
Employed, then probably.
If you haven't got a damn job, unemployment's a hell of a lot more important. But if you've got a job, maybe inflation is more important to you. And so the politicians come out and pander to you, perhaps based on what they think you think is more important. Okay so far?